beginning at line 14, strike
Gentleman
provided.
from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order on the gentleman's amendment.
Point of order is reserved. Clerk will read.
Page 47, beginning at line 14, strike provided further that funds provided under Section 2003 of the Homeland Security Act of 2002.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to waive the reading requirement of my amendment.
Is there objection? Seeing none, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What this amendment does is remove the restriction that the Urban Area Security Initiative funding should be restricted to the top 10 urban areas by risk. You see, there are other metropolitan areas in this country that I believe are at similar or even higher risk of terrorist attack or damage through any other type of catastrophe. The Metro Detroit area is one of those. That area, the area that I represent, has the busiest border crossing in all of North America. It has an international airport. It has a huge metropolitan population center. It has the world headquarters of General Motors. We're at high risk of an attack, but yet right now, according to the Homeland Security risk matrix, we're not rated in the top 10. We should be eligible for this funding as well as other metropolitan areas. Here's the point. Even though bin Laden is now gone, we are still at risk of a terrorist attack in this country, but it's more than likely that that terrorist will likely come from within the borders. So the first defense that we have against terrorism or any other natural disaster is our first responders. We need more firefighters, more police officers, more emergency medical providers. They need to be properly trained and have the equipment, the radios and communication devices to communicate to each other. The best way to protect our citizens, it's not spending it only overseas, all of our tax dollars, but investing it here right at home. This amendment will make sure that urban areas who are at high risk of an attack, such as Metro Detroit, get the funds that they need. The bottom line point is this. The reason why we should step in to support our local units of government is because this Congress in the past did not effectively address the foreclosure crisis, which has really robbed local units of government of their power to fund their first responders. The property values have dropped so low, the money isn't even there. I'm asking Congress now, don't turn your back on this obligation to the American people. Let's redirect money to the Homeland Security budget, to our first responders, our people that are there at the first line of defense against an attack from a terrorist or against any type of natural disaster that could impact our people. Mr. Chair, I urge this committee's support for this amendment. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I withdraw my reservation on the point of order. Mr. Chairman,
reservation is withdrawn. Seeks recognition. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The bill before us today is born out of the need for reform. It consolidates disparate grant programs and provides discretion to the Secretary. These reforms include funding reductions, requirements for measurement, and requirements for spending languishing dollars. The consolidation in this bill forces the Secretary to examine the intelligence and risk and put scarce dollars where they are needed most, whether it's a port, rail, surveillance, or access and hardening of projects, or whether it is to high-risk urban areas or to states, as opposed to reverse engineering projects to fill the amount designated for of many programs or granting funds to lower risk. Additionally, as noted by the gentleman, the bill limits Urban Area Security Initiative grants to the top 10 highest cities. Again, this puts scarce dollars to where they are needed most. That means that cities like New York are funded at significantly higher levels than other cities because they are the highest threat urban area. I don't think anyone here can argue with that. This does not mean lower risk areas will lose all funding. It just means the funds will come from other programs such as state Homeland grants that are risk and formula based. I strongly urge my colleague to support fiscal discipline by aligning funding with the areas of highest risk and vote no on this amendment.
The gentleman yield his time back.
I yield back.
Purpose is the gentleman from New York rise.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
There is currently an amendment pending.
Same amendment. Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, our amendment would enhance public safety in communities across the country by striking the provision in the bill that would limit participation in the Urban Area Security Initiative program to just 10 cities. Homeland Security Secretary Napolitano has said that the architecture of Homeland Security begins in the homeland. The Urban Area Security Initiative program protects the hometown by allowing first responders and emergency officials to practice coordinating response scenarios across jurisdictional lines. Until recently, the program supported these crucial activities in 64 communities, including my own, judged by the Department of Homeland Security to be vulnerable to terrorist attack. That was until we decimated the program by cutting 20% of its funding in the continuing resolution. Rather than allow all communities to suffer cuts proportionately, the Department made matters worse by deciding to eliminate half of the 64 communities from the program, including all 4 communities in upstate New York. Let us not make third mistake this year by limiting participation to this important program to even fewer urban areas. Mr. Chairman, my community of Western New York includes 4 international bridge crossings, the busiest passenger crossing at the northern border, the largest electricity producer in New York State, and the homegrown al-Qaeda terrorist cell, the Lackawanna 6. It sits along 2 Great Lakes, which contain the largest freshwater supply in the world, and is within 500-mile radius of 55% of the American population and 62% of the Canadian population. For 8 years, the Department evaluated Western New York to be a highly vulnerable area and thus eligible for the Urban Area Security Initiative. Now this year, the Department wants to eliminate us from the program, and this bill would codify that decision. Why? What has changed? We are still vulnerable according to the Department's own assessment, and we still need the resources to prevent and respond to attacks. Mr. Chairman, this body should not prevent my community or the other 54 communities the Department has judged to be vulnerable from this essential Homeland Security program. I oppose this provision of the bill, and I urge adoption of our amendment. Mr. Chairman, finally, I'd like to thank the co-sponsors of this amendment, Representative Reichert, Tonko, Ellison, Moore, Wasserman Schultz, Capps, Slaughter, Cuellar, Fudge, and Wilson. And now I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Berkeley.
Okay.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. I rise in support of the Higgins amendment to eliminate a provision in this bill that would harm Las Vegas, Phoenix, Denver, Miami, Atlanta, Baltimore, Detroit, and a dozen more cities around the country. This bill before us would eliminate any funding for the Urban Area Security Initiative for all but the top 10 highest-risk urban areas, leaving over 50 U.S. cities off the list, including my own city of Las Vegas, one of the greatest tourist destinations in the world, with over 37 million visitors a year. For almost a decade, UASI program has worked to help cities prevent and protect themselves from threats and acts of terrorism. Not too long ago, over 60 U.S. cities received funding to help them purchase equipment, develop recovery plans, and implement counterterrorism strategies. In my home city of Las Vegas, for example, we've created the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center, where 18 state, local, and federal agencies all work together to detect and prevent terrorist and other Homeland Security-related events. This kind of fusion center is based on the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission to help law enforcement agencies communicate communicate more effectively so they can put the pieces together that could prevent attacks. UASI funding has been an essential part of that center, and cutting off funding to that center now would put their excellent and possibly life-saving work at risk. Southern Nevada is home to Nellis Air Force Base and Hoover Dam and some of the largest hotels on the planet. We know that some of the 9/11 terrorists visited Las Vegas before the horrific attack on our nation. Mr. Speaker, after the capture and killing of Osama bin Laden, we also know that terrorists are increasingly focusing their interests on mid-sized cities rather than large cities. Many of those would now not be receiving federal funding were this provision to become law. This is being done when the risk of retaliation by both homegrown terrorists and Al-Qaeda affiliates is very high. I implore my colleagues not to leave some of America's greatest cities vulnerable and without the necessary funding to protect themselves. At a time when states and local governments are struggling to balance their budgets, we need help more than ever to prevent and prepare against terrorist attacks. This provision would be salt to the wounds. I urge support for this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from New York.
I rise to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the amendment. While I have serious misgivings about the funding levels for FEMA first responder grants, restoration of the Urban Area Security Initiative to its intended purpose is good policy. By limiting UASI recipients to the 10 highest-risk cities, Chairman Aderholt would ensure that UASI is focused on addressing the unique planning, equipment, and training needs of high-threat, high-density urban areas in order to prevent, respond to, and recover from acts of terrorism against the highest-risk American targets. Originally distributed to 7 metropolitan areas, UASI ballooned to 64 regions in FY10, many of which were neither high threat nor high density. By increasing the number of UASI recipients without additional funding, this amendment would deplete resources for cities most at risk for terrorist attack. With intelligence about intent to attack the United States around the 10th anniversary of September 11th, which is fast approaching, now is the time to focus our resources where they are most needed, not spread the wealth. Every region, however, I want to make it clear to my colleague, every region is entitled to federal security resources. And that's why the State Homeland Security Grant Program provides funding to each state and territory. However, in addition, Congress has a responsibility to allocate funding to address unique needs, and UASI was intentionally designed to protect those densely populated areas most at risk. The 9/11 Commission said it best, and I quote, "Federal Homeland Security assistance should not remain a program for general revenue sharing. It should supplement state and local resources based on the risks or vulnerabilities that merit additional support. Congress should not use this money as a pork barrel," end quote. So, I want to make a couple of other points, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment for the following reasons. For example, based on projections recently released by FEMA for FY11, New York State will receive more than $141 million in DHS funds separate from UASI. Buffalo will be one of 5 cities in New York to receive funding from the Metropolitan Medical Response System. That's $1.4 million for these cities. Further, Buffalo is scheduled to receive more than $1.4 million from the Port Security Grant Program. In FY10, Erie County also received $940,000 from the Interoperable Emergency Communications Grant Program, a program which I had a little bit to do to create. Lastly, the Robert Moses Power Plant was previously awarded a buffer zone protection grant in FY07, only 58% of which has been spent. So I want to make it very clear. I can go on. Michigan got $21,468,166, and we have a whole list of what other cities have gotten and states because they deserve that money. Every state, region, and community is entitled to federal resources for Homeland Security. However, UASI was a program that was not intended to spread the wealth among every region, and other DHS initiatives better address the needs of most areas of the country. So, I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Who seeks time?
Chair.
Gentleman from New York.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the amendment offered by my colleague regarding the Urban Area Security Initiative. As New Yorkers, we know firsthand the absolutely critical role that our state and local police and firefighters play in preventing and responding to attacks on the American homeland. The Urban Area Security Initiative, administered, or UASI, administered by the Department of Homeland Security, is a program focused on enhancing regional preparedness in high-risk areas by fostering better communication and collaboration amongst local fire responders. Given the struggles we have faced since the crisis on Wall Street, these are communities that increasingly cannot afford to provide their citizens, our citizens, with the same level of protection that UASI enables. This bill, as written, arbitrarily restricts UASI to allow only 10 urban areas to be eligible for the program and its funding, down from more than 60 in previous years. No one here today would argue that Manhattan and Los Angeles are undeserving of priority assistance. However, with this arbitrary cap, we will endanger the progress that many other high-risk urban areas have made to protect our citizens from attacks and crises. We will threaten the ability of these communities, including my community in upstate New York, to safeguard our citizens. We are making these cuts at home while we pay hundreds of billions of dollars each year for our military-industrial complex to fight an incredibly expensive war in Afghanistan with the aim of preventing terror attacks in America. We are going to spend more than $12 billion this year to build up Afghan security forces, while our own security forces in Albany and the capital region and 50 other cities across America are stripped of their funding under UASI. Is our strategic thinking that backwards, or is it just more lucrative to build a multi-billion-dollar army halfway around the world than to help our police and firefighters here at home protect and defend our constituents? I would propose to take $1 billion of that $12 billion and put it back into a deserving and necessary program like UASI. But according to the rules set by the Republican leadership, that is not allowed. So I stand here today in support of this amendment and in support of New York. In my home district in upstate New York, the Albany Urban Area Working Group has used UASI grants to make great strides forward in boosting local cooperation and collaborative planning. This group unites participants from Albany, Rensselaer, Sarasota, around a common goal of protecting a region critical to the security of New York State and the stability of America. From building a truly interoperable regional communications network to securing the capital region's critical infrastructure, the work of this group is absolutely vital to protecting the Empire State. Whether threatened by natural or man-made disasters, it is clear that New York is and should be at the top of our priority list to protect. I represent New York's capital region, an area that bears tremendous economic and symbolic importance. 35 million people live within a 200-mile radius of our state capital in Albany. Albany also houses New York's most vital state government facilities and more than 11,000 state government employees that keep the Empire State up and running. These functions are vital, not only to our area, but also to our fellow New Yorkers downstate and across our state, and to Americans across this country who do business in, with, and through New York. The capital region is also home to the third fastest growing hub for science and technology jobs in our nation. That projected clustering, alongside high-profile research and development centers in our Tech Valley corridor, add to the vital importance of this region to an American economy that needs more leaders in innovation. In Albany, we host a world-renowned nanotechnology research center where 250 industry leaders partner with the United States Army to push us past the current bounds of science. In Schenectady, we host GE's Renewable Energy Global Headquarters. In Schoharie, our reservoir provides a significant portion of New York City's water supply. In Watervliet, we have a one-of-a-kind Army arsenal And just a few miles away, we host an atomic power laboratory doing world-class R&D for the United States Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program. Nearby in Malta is a facility that will soon be the most advanced chip fabrication plant in the world. The hometown heroes who protect all of these facilities and more will lose their funding through UOSC entirely if this bill passes in its current form. And so, in support of New York's capital region and similar areas across this country, I stand in support of this amendment. This amendment that will remove an arbitrary 10-city restriction on the UOSC program from this bill. This amendment that will not add $1 to the debt or deficit. This amendment that will not cost us one single dollar, but rather will provide us a common sense approach. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to support the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Clark. I represent Columbus, Ohio, which in the past has been one of the Tier 2 cities that's received Urban Security Initiative funds, and the current version of this bill would restrict Urban Security Initiative funds to only Tier 1 cities, which would be the top 10 riskiest cities. The problem is the risks don't stop at number 10, and it's not clear that there's any significant reduction in risk between the 10th riskiest city and the 11th riskiest city. This is an arbitrary decision, and the Clark Amendment ends the arbitrary 10-city restriction and allows the Department of Homeland Security to have discretion in funding risks. It does not increase funding 1 cent. I urge adoption of the Clark Amendment, and I'd just like to make it clear that the whole point of this amendment is to remove an arbitrary restriction and give the Department of Homeland Security the ability to fund where the risks are. This amendment does not add a dime to the cost, and it just removes or increases flexibility, and it won't necessarily cost cities like New York or any other city any funds. All it does is allow cities to be eligible so that if there's real risk there and the Department of Homeland Security chooses to fund that city, then they can fund it. So it's a common sense approach. I ask my colleagues to support the Clark approach, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from California.
Strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of the amendment offered by my colleague regarding UOSC. This amendment will better ensure that all cities and localities will be eligible for critical UOSC funding, not just those under the arbitrary cap that are in the underlying bill. UOSC funding is critical to my district of Sacramento, California, and a number of other major American cities. It has helped create and develop one of the nation's foremost counterterrorism and readiness task forces located at the former McClellan Air Force Base in my district. This facility has greatly enhanced the collaboration and communication amongst local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies and first responders. From there, officials are better able to prevent attacks by training, sharing information, and coordinating investigations. Thinkable scenario in which an attack does occur, this facility, funded by UOSC dollars, will better able the region's law enforcement and first responders to react and respond to an attack. The coordination and collaborative efforts at this facility are critical and will help limit further harm. Limiting or cutting UOSC funding could devastate this counterterrorism and readiness task force and negatively impact the work they have undertaken to ensure the better coordination and communication amongst law enforcement officials and emergency responders. One compelling lesson learned from the terrorist attacks on 9/11 was that emergency responders and law enforcement officials need to have streamlined communication and command and control infrastructures. This facility is the embodiment of that lesson. The threat to Sacramento should not be taken lightly. Sacramento is the capital of California, the most populous state in the Union, and the 7th largest economy in the world. It is critical to continue to support the anti- and counterterrorism work being done there. It is unacceptable to leave this region without appropriate funding to ensure its protection, as Sacramento and the region have important security needs. A mere 30-minute drive upstream from Sacramento along the American River lies the Folsom Dam, which holds water back from hundreds of thousands of homes, the state capitol building, state and local agencies, and thousands of small businesses. A terrorist attack there has the potential to devastate Sacramento and much of the surrounding region through massive flooding. Beyond the human toll, which is unthinkable, this would have a crippling effect on California and on the country as a whole. Sacramento is home to numerous state and federal agencies and facilities. Government buildings and facilities are high-profile targets and require vigilant protection, and further highlight the need for UOSI funding in my district. My district is also home to a number of transportation systems, from light rail to passenger rail to commercial freight rail. An attack could, again aside from the human toll, greatly hamper nationwide commerce and impair the national economy. Mr. Chairman, this amendment will bolster our nation's security by better providing more communities across the nation with the tools and training necessary to keep us safe. I urge my colleagues to vote in support of this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from from Louisiana. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the Clark amendment. In fact, I have a similar amendment filed at the desk that I won't need to bring forward because this amendment accomplishes the same thing. What the amendment says is all of those cities, the 54 cities that were arbitrarily removed from eligibility, should have that same opportunity to compete for these Homeland Security grants. Doesn't increase funding at all, but says why are we limiting our threat assessment cities to 10 cities when, in fact, many other cities have exposure to risks. And if we just look at what we've found so far from the raid of Osama bin Laden's compound, they looked through and found some of the things that these terrorist cells may be going after. And in fact, some of the very terrorist threats were targeting areas that are included in some of these cities that have arbitrarily been removed from eligibility for these Homeland Security grants. So all we're saying is in cities like New Orleans, and if you just look at the corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and both cities, both New Orleans and Baton Rouge, were arbitrarily removed from eligibility, between the Port of New Orleans and all the shipping transport that's done there, as well as all of the oil and gas infrastructure for our country that's located in that region, all the chemical plants that are located in that region, they are part of that terrorist assessment that were determined in the data that we've retrieved from Osama bin Laden's compound, including the threat to oil tankers and ships, some of the very commerce that moves through the Port of New Orleans, and yet the Port of New Orleans is removed from eligibility. So this amendment doesn't guarantee that they will get any access to these grants, but what it does say is they've got the ability to compete if the terrorist threat is determined to be high enough to where they should be able to get the funding from those grants. Because our terrorist threats change from day to day, from year to year. We get more information, just as we've recently gotten a treasure trove of new information on where those threats are. Why should we arbitrarily remove some of the very cities that may rise to the top of that list? And so this gives the flexibility back to the Department of Homeland Security to allow those other cities to compete where there are real terrorist threats. And so that's what this amendment does. I support the amendment, and hopefully we'll be able to get this language added back in, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment offered by my colleague regarding UOSI. This amendment corrects a provision that arbitrarily limits UOSI eligibility to the top 10 high-risk cities. This limitation would reduce locales eligible for UOSI grants by more than 50 cities as compared to just last year, excluding cities such as Cleveland from receiving these grants. The UOSI grant program provides unique equipment, planning, and training to help local authorities, first responders, law enforcement, and agencies. This program specifically addresses the needs in high-threat urban areas to help these communities prepare, prevent, and protect and recover from a terrorist attack and other disasters. Large cities are not the only targets for terrorist attacks. We know now Osama bin Laden urged his followers to plot attacks in smaller U.S. cities, Smaller cities were to be used as staging grounds to plan and test attacks in larger cities. That is why UASI is so important. UASI funding has been utilized to equip, train, and exercise first responders and safety personnel for improvised explosive devices and WMD-specific events. If funding is completely cut, the lives of first responders and the public will be placed in grave danger due to the lack of equipment, training, and exercises. The City of Cleveland launched the Public Safety Systems Automation Project utilizing UASI funding to enhance the Cleveland Department of Public Safety Information Systems. This effort aided the city in its modernization of public safety systems. The new information systems include mobile computing systems that connect public safety officers to federal, state, and county information in their vehicles, and computer-aided dispatch, which facilitates the transmission of fire EMS and police and automated vehicle location. These systems assist in mitigating emergencies, protecting safety personnel, and improving the protection of life and property. Cleveland has applied its allotted portion of Department of Homeland Security money to 1,400 personal protective equipment items, WMD training to over 1,700 safety personnel, NIMS, ICS training, Homeland Security planning, personnel, surveillance equipment for areas of critical infrastructure, computer-aided dispatch for police, fire, and EMS, and the Northeast Ohio Regional Fusion Center. Homeland Security planning personnel are essential to strengthening the City of Cleveland's preparedness planning activities. They have outlined the Downtown Cleveland Emergency Evacuation Plan, Inclement Weather Plan, Emergency Operations Plan, and the Continuity of Operations Plan, which provide important support to citizens during the event of a disaster. Without the planning personnel, the city's emergency management response capabilities would be severely limited, and the lives of first responders and the public would be in severe danger. Mr. Chair, these funds are necessary to address the security needs of our nation. I support this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote in favor of it. I yield back.
Who seeks time? Gentlelady from Wisconsin.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to support this amendment. In fact, I had an identical amendment to strike this restrictive language with respect to the Urban Area Security Initiative. In fiscal year 2010, over 60 urban areas, including my own city of Milwaukee, were eligible for formula assistance under this grant because they met the Department of Homeland Security's risk assessment analysis. But the legislation before us would arbitrarily tie the Secretary's hands from distributing these funds to any cities that fall outside the top 10 so-called most vulnerable. Since 2004, the city of Milwaukee and the surrounding counties that surround Milwaukee, Ozaukee, Racine, Washington, and Waukesha, have obtained nearly $400 million in this UAC funding to enhance the safety of over 2 million residents. And even though this assistance has been small, we're very, very proud of what we've been able to accomplish in terms of securing our area. For example, in Milwaukee, my constituents are safer because we've used this assistance to train emergency medical teams, train and equip hazardous material and bomb squads, create continuity of operations plans, and to analyze intelligence. It also helps to fund our Intelligence Fusion Center, a place to collect and exchange information from government, public safety, private sector, and all levels of enforcement. And I have heard concerns from our mayor, police chief, fire chief about whether or not we can continue to manage disaster funding without this funding. And the funds, the concerns aren't just limited to being prepared to acts of terrorism. The loss of this funding would disable us from being prepared to respond to large-scale emergencies such as flooding or tornadoes. I can tell you that it is penny-wise and pound-foolish to simply arbitrarily limit this funding. It just doesn't make any sense to go backwards. You've heard here already on this floor that officials have reported that Osama bin Laden's documents even schooled his followers to avoid U.S. counter-terrorist defenses. He said, don't limit attacks to New York City. Consider other areas or smaller cities. Spread out the targets. We just might as well fax Al-Qaeda the list of urban areas that will lose federal support. Areas like Phoenix, Anaheim, Santa Ana, Riverside, Denver, Miami-Dade, Fort Lauderdale, Palm Beach, Orlando, Tampa, Atlanta, Baltimore, Detroit, Twin Cities, St. Louis, Las Vegas, Charlotte, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Portland, Pittsburgh, Norfolk, Seattle, Tucson, Bakersfield, Oxnard, Sacramento, Bridgeport, Hartford, Jacksonville, Honolulu, Indianapolis, Louisville, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Kansas City, Omaha, Albany, Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Columbus, Toledo, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, San Juan, Providence, Memphis, Nashville, Austin, El Paso, San Antonio, Salt Lake City, Richmond, and Milwaukee. This amendment is simple, budget neutral, and gives the administration power, administrative power, back to the experts who are there solely to keep our cities and country safe. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks time? Gentleman from Connecticut.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the amendment offered today by the gentleman from New York. At its core, this amendment is simple, but its impact is significant. The bill we are currently debating contains a provision that would arbitrarily limit UASI eligibility for 2012 to areas within the country deemed to be the top 10 high-risk cities. If passed as it is, this bill would reduce the number of communities eligible for UASI grants by more than 50 cities, many of them named by my colleague from Wisconsin. Among them, the Bridgeport-Stanford metropolitan area, which includes the majority of the cities and towns in my district. I strongly support this amendment, which removes the language from the bill that illogically restricts UASI funding to just 10 cities. Since its creation in 2003, the intent of the UASI program has been to enhance regional preparedness in and around major metropolitan areas and to assist participating jurisdictions in developing integrated regional systems for prevention, protection, response, and recovery. Setting an arbitrary limit on the number of locations eligible to receive funding under this program is contrary to the intent of the program and contrary to our efforts to address the growing and evolving threats of homegrown terrorism. Moreover, this restriction is dangerous. Localities with the highest risk of being attacked are often not the locality where those attacks are being planned and can be stopped. In my district, the loss of UASI funding would completely derail a major interagency communications project. In addition, much of the counterterrorism work underway in Fairfield County has been implemented in phases. A reduction in funds at this point will effectively waste the work that has already been done. The risks to my constituents are very real. My district's proximity to New York City not only increases the likelihood of a terrorist attack, but also increases the potential that someone in our area will plan an attack with the intention of inflicting the attack on New York City. We have seen this time and time again. After local law enforcement officials from Fairfield County helped to capture Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, last year, Faisal Shahzad, who had operated in my district, it is unfathomable to think that their work would be deemed non-essential in the fight against terrorism. And just 2 weeks ago, on May 19th, a Bridgeport resident accused of making and selling pipe bombs was arrested after allegedly attempting to sell 8 of these explosive cylinders in the Bronx. While we can all agree that shared sacrifice is required to bring our federal deficit under control, I cannot support cuts to a national security program which has proven to be not just effective, but also essential to our safety. This is a time for our communities to stay vigilant. Without the proper resources, our communities cannot maintain the proper level of readiness and cannot ensure that our communities are properly secured. I strongly urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Who seeks time? The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last
Gentleman is
word
recognized for 5 minutes.
and yield my time to the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Lowy.
The gentlelady is recognized.
And I would like to rise for clarification. With great respect for my colleagues and understanding the importance of Homeland Security dollars, I am very concerned that there seems to be a misunderstanding. I would like to read again the quote from the 9/11 Commission. Quote, "Federal Homeland Security assistance should not remain a program for general revenue sharing. It should supplement state and local resources based on the risks or vulnerability that merit additional support. Congress should not use this money as a pork barrel." I would also like to remind my good friends that under the Homeland Security Grant Program, there are many other sources of funding for these communities. California, for example, is getting $153,953,988. Connecticut is getting over $12 million. Nevada is getting over $10 million, et cetera, et cetera. So there seems to be some misunderstanding that the UASI program should cover all the Homeland Security funding for these states. We believe strongly that there are reasons for funding, certainly by formula, and that's the way this bill is written, almost every city, over 50 cities in the United States. But the UASI funding is specifically targeted to those areas, such as New York, that are pointed to by the terrorists. I don't want to mention bin Laden, but others. They clearly are the most at risk. And if you're number one, there clearly should be a rationale for getting the funding. So those 10 cities will be getting the funding because they're most at risk, but the other Homeland Security funding will be divided by formula to all the other representatives of states that are here today. So I respect your needs. I think it's very important, and there is money in this bill that would cover the needs which you so articulately discussed today. Thank you. I yield back.
Speaks time. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last
Gentleman is
word.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York, Congressman Higgins. The Urban Area Security Initiative is administered by the Department of Homeland Security. It's a critical program focused on enhancing regional preparedness in high-risk areas by fostering better communication and collaboration among local first responders. These grants provide local authorities, first responders, and law enforcement with the resources they need to prepare for, prevent, and recover from attacks and other disasters impacting communities across America. This Homeland Security Appropriations bill is dangerous as it restricts the initiative to allow only 10 urban areas to be eligible for the program and its funding. This would cause more than 50 cities, including Atlanta, to lose funds. Mr. Chair, as we all know, terrorists do not limit their attack to only 10 cities. We should not leave Americans who do not live in these 10 cities unnecessarily and arbitrarily vulnerable to disaster. My home state of Georgia greatly benefits from the Urban Area Security Initiative grants. In 2010, the Atlanta urban area received $13.5 million in grants. Atlanta, one of the most populous and fast-growing cities in the region and home to the world's busiest airport, and already the scene of one terrorist attack during the 1996 Olympics, would lose critical funding under this bill. The Fusion Center in Atlanta not only benefits the metropolitan area, but the entire state of Georgia. The Fusion Center is an information hub for the state. Local law enforcement and officials collect suspicious activity reports and send them to federal law enforcement officials. In the 4th District of Georgia, the DeKalb County Fire Rescue Corps recently received an Urban Area Security Initiative grant from FEMA, which will enable it to operate a mobile canteen rehab unit that supplies food and beverages for firefighters and emergency responders during lengthy emergency incidents. The funds have also been used to support citizens' corps and community efforts towards preparedness and community response efforts. These funds are critical to helping Georgia develop a regional exercise plan, develop annexes to include tactical operations for use during an evacuation, and for emergency public information. Mr. Chairman, I stand here in support of this bipartisan amendment that would remove this arbitrary restriction on this program from this bill. I urge all of my colleagues to support this common sense amendment, which would not add 1 penny to the debt or deficit. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Does anybody else seek time? Seeing none, the questions on the amendment is offered by the gentleman from Michigan. All those in favor signify so by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay. No. The opinion of Chair, the noes have it.
For a recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan will be postponed. The gentleman from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Heck of Nevada, page 47, line 17, strike 10 and insert 25.
Gentleman from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm offering this amendment to restore funding to the top 25 cities under the Urban Area Security Initiative. This issue is personal to me. I spent a great deal of my career in the anti-terrorism field. I've developed threat assessments and plans for terrorism countermeasures and prevention on the local, state, and federal levels. I oversaw medical response operations to the embassy bombings in East Africa in 1998 and the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000, and I was a first responder to the World Trade Centers. I felt the heat from the rubble pile as it melted firefighters' boots. I breathed the dust and chaos into my lungs as we worked around the clock. I've seen terrorism firsthand, and we must do everything possible to prevent another attack on this U.S. homeland. One of the failures identified after the 9/11 attacks was the lack of coordination between local first responders and federal counterterrorism specialists. The UASI grant fills this vacuum. If this amendment doesn't pass, key areas terrorism readiness funding will go away. I understand the need to prioritize dollars and scarce resources, but limiting funding to a cap of 10 cities threatens our overall national preparedness. This amendment does not increase costs, but expands the total number of cities under consideration to at least 25. Let me tell you about my district, my area, Las Vegas and Clark County. According to the Department of Homeland Security, we have 221 elements of critical infrastructure and key resources. These include the Hoover Dam, which supplies power to over 500 million homes, and the new dam bypass bridge, which is the second highest bridge in the United States. We have Nellis Air Force Base and the world-famous Las Vegas Strip. The Las Vegas area is also home to 17 of the world's 20 largest hotels with almost 149,000 rooms. At the corner of Las Vegas Boulevard and Tropicana Boulevard, there are more hotel rooms than in the entire city of San Francisco. And we have seen that the hospitality and tourism industry has become the soft target of choice since 9/11, with 9 attacks against international hotel resorts over the last 9 years, including the coordinated attacks in Mumbai in 2008. 2 weeks ago, I toured the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Fusion Center, our state's primary fusion center. These centers facilitate greater cooperation between local first responders and federal counterterrorism specialists and are supported by UASI funding. Now is not the time to recreate the vacuum that existed prior to the UASI program. Now is the time to stand behind those who stand on the front lines, providing the blanket of protection under which we rest at night. It is for these reasons that I offer this reasonable and measured amendment that increases the number of eligible cities to 25, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Who seeks time? Gentleman from Alabama.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The bill before us today was born out of the need for reform. It consolidates various grant programs and provides discretion to the Secretary. These reforms include funding reductions, requirements for measurement, and requirements for spending languishing dollars. The consolidation of this bill forces the Secretary to examine the intelligence and risk and put scarce dollars where they are needed most, whether it is port, rail, surveillance, or whether it's high-risk urban areas or to states, as opposed to reverse engineering projects to fill the amount designated for one of the many programs or granting funds to lower risk areas. Additionally, as noted by the gentleman, the bill limits Urban Area Security Initiative grants to the top 10 highest cities. Again, this puts scarce dollars to where they are most needed. That means cities like New York are funded at the significantly higher levels than other cities because they're the highest threat to urban areas. I don't think anyone here can argue with that. This does not mean lower risk areas will lose all funding. It will just mean the funds will come from other programs, such as state Homeland grants, that are risk and formula-based. I strongly urge my colleagues to support fiscal discipline by aligning funding with areas of highest risk and vote no on this amendment. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does any other member seek time? Seeing none, the questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Nevada. All those in favor signify so by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I rise to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, as we approach the 10th anniversary of 9/11 attacks, we're reminded that a key recommendation of the 9/11 Commission is still not completely addressed. That is the security of the most commonly used form of identification in the United States, driver's license. All but one of the 9/11 hijackers carried some form of government-issued ID, mostly state driver's license, many of which were obtained on fraudulent manners. During the planning stages of the attacks, these documents were used to rent vehicles, evade law enforcement officials, enroll in flight school, and board airplanes. In 2005, Congress passed and the President signed the Real ID Act to address this security gap and require states to meet certain security standards for the issuance of driver's license and identification cards. Despite that action 6 years ago, Real ID has yet to be fully implemented. My distinguished colleague, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Smith, has some views to offer on this important topic, and I yield for the gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman from Alabama for yielding. He is absolutely correct. On September 11, 2001, Americans were attacked by foreign nationals who were able to exploit our laws and live unnoticed in the United States. The 19 hijackers obtained 17 driver's licenses from Arizona, California, and Florida, and 13 state-issued IDs from Florida, Virginia, and Maryland. With these licenses and identification cards, they boarded the planes they used to murder over 3,000 innocent Americans. The 9/11 Commission recommended that, quote, the federal government should set standards for the issuance of birth certificates and sources of identification, such as driver's licenses. Fraud in identification documents is no longer just a problem of theft. At many entry points to vulnerable facilities, including gates for boarding aircraft, sources of identification are the last opportunity to ensure that people are who they say they are and to check whether they are terrorists, end quote. Congress paid attention and passed the Real ID Act. The law is critical to national security. This administration has undermined the Real ID Act at every turn. They extended the compliance deadline 2 times, most recently last March. So now states do not have to be Real ID compliant until January 15, 2013. That is 11.5 years after the 9/11 attacks. And Secretary Napolitano consistently pushes for repeal of Real ID instead of compliance. Most recently, during a March 9, 2011 Senate Judiciary hearing, she urged Congress to take a fresh look at legislation that would actually repeal the Real ID Act. States are making progress on Real ID. In fact, as of March 29, 2011, Maryland, Tennessee, Connecticut, South Dakota, and Delaware have submitted full compliance certification packages to DHS. 23 other states are compliant, and/or are issuing compliant documents. 4 additional states have enhanced driver's license programs comparable to Real ID guidelines. For these reasons, congressional support, including funding, is critical to Real ID implementation. I am concerned that H.R. 2017's grant reform initiative may give the impression that Congress no longer supports Real ID funding. So I ask the gentleman from Alabama, how do you respond to that concern?
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for yielding back, and I strongly support the Real ID implementation. Real ID is the law. The Department has an obligation to support the states in moving forward toward full compliance with enhanced driver's license security. Congress has appropriated a steady stream of funding for Real ID since 2006, $295 million to be exact. Additionally, driver's license security is an allowable expense under the State Homeland Security Grant Program. So the actions taken in this bill should in no way be taken as a sign of diminishing support for Real ID implementation.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for that statement, and I ask him if he would yield for another minute.
Yes, I yield the gentleman from Texas for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the remarks of the gentleman from Alabama and his endorsement of the Real ID Act. The risk to not implementing Real ID is great. Perhaps most recently this was evidenced by the facts surrounding the February arrest of Khaled al-Dosari in Texas on a federal charge of attempted use of a weapon of mass destruction. According to the arrest affidavit, when the FBI searched his residence, they found his journal in which he wrote of the need to obtain a forged U.S. birth certificate, multiple driver's licenses, and a U.S. passport. He planned to use those driver's licenses to rent several cars, each with a different license, specifically to avoid detection. So terrorists are still planning to exploit the weaknesses in our driver's license issuance processes in order to attack us. If we don't do everything in our power to prevent that from happening by fully implementing Real ID, we set ourselves up for another attack. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with the gentleman from Alabama as this bill moves forward and on future appropriation bills to support states as they move toward full implementation of Real ID. I'll yield back.
That has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I withdraw any action right now.
The gentleman withdraws. The clerk will read.
Page 50, line 10, firefighter assistant grants, $350 million, of which $200 million shall be available to carry out Section 33 of that Act, shall be available to carry out Section 34 of that Act, to remain available until September 30th,
from New York.
To waive the reading.
Gentleman from New York has an amendment at the desk and asks unanimous consent to waive the reading of the amendment.
And I rise to strike the last word.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Lowy, New York, page 50, line 9, before the period insert provided further that an additional...
I waive the reading of the amendment.
Without objection, the reading of the bill...
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman was suspended. The gentlelady's amendment falls within the previous paragraph. Is the gentlelady seeking unanimous consent to return to the previous paragraph?
I ask unanimous consent to return to the
Is there objection?
Object.
Gentleman from Alabama objects.
I rise to strike the last word, then.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, my amendment would address 2 critical shortfalls in the fiscal year 2012 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill: inadequate funding for communities devastated by recent disasters and for first responder and anti-terror programs. We have a responsibility to help rebuild homes and businesses following disasters throughout the South and Midwest, where communities are reeling and families are mourning and rebuilding. Chairman Aderholt, whose Alabama district was devastated by tornadoes, took the first step in committee by increasing disaster relief funding, and I supported his efforts. My amendment builds upon his work to provide an additional $1.5 billion in disaster relief to help FEMA respond to needs that far exceed funding levels in this bill. Just as we have a responsibility, however, to help communities rebuild from national disasters, we must help them prepare for and prevent man-made ones. Funding for FEMA's first responder grants, as well as the proposed block grant structure, provide inadequate levels to protect and prepare the top terror targets in the nation or keep our communities safe from fire hazards. The State Homeland Security, Urban Area Security Initiative, Transit Security, Port Security, and additional grant programs will be forced to compete against each other for only 2/3 of the $1 billion provided for first responder grants, which is a cut of roughly $1.5 billion for the programs. Further, by dramatically reducing funding for firefighter grants, the Republican majority would shift a tremendous burden to local communities to either slash services or increase taxes to ensure adequate fire coverage. My amendment would increase funding for disaster relief by an additional $1.5 billion, while also bringing first responder and fire grant programs back to their FY11 levels. Now, some of my colleagues across the aisle object to funding recovering efforts without offsets. Those from areas affected by recent disasters, including Republican Senator Roy Blunt, understand that the overwhelming recovery need must be prioritized, and all of us know the repercussions of allowing our first responders to go unprepared or untrained in this dangerous world. Earlier this year, even before the death of Osama bin Laden increased our state of alert, Secretary Napolitano testified that we were at our most heightened state of terrorist threat since September 11th. If this bill is adopted without my amendment, hundreds of millions of dollars in anti-terror funds will be taken from our most targeted regions. Just weeks after intelligence gathered at Osama bin Laden's compound indicates a clear intent to strike the nation coinciding with the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, such reductions would be unconscionable. So I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I reserve my time.
His time has expired.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from North Carolina.